Hello, my name is David Deike, and welcome to my interpersonal communication project for Liberty University Health Services 508. Next slide. Interpersonal communication is part of our everyday life. It is more complex, however, than the act of carrying on a personal conversation between individuals. Stewart describes interpersonal communication as the type or kind of communication that happens when people involved talk and listen in ways that maximize the presence of the personal. But maybe he should have phrased it with listen before talk. Next slide. To improve on interpersonal communication, you must enlarge the conversation. Enlarging the conversation basically means to make the necessary improvements in areas of our communication that prevent us from being effective communicators. Stewart mentions that successful communication is dependent on the communicator being aware of their environment or factors that help or hinder conversation. Next slide. Enlarging the conversation depends on first identifying areas needing improvements. These should be our overarching goals or areas we want to improve on, like communication deficiencies or barriers to communication. Enlarging the conversation is also dependent on the communicator being aware of factors that shape their communication style, such as personality and behavior, as well as personal values, their belief system, and opinions that influence the conversation. Next slide. My overarching goal is to become a more effective communicator in my personal and professional life, using improved listening skills to enhance the outcome and direction of my conversations. This will ultimately enlarge my conversation, improving the relationships I have already established and create positive influences or outcomes with individuals I'm less familiar with. Next slide. I've identified 4 specific areas to improve on, which will help me reach my overarching goals. The first is listening. Second, appropriate nexting. Third, controlling emotions. And finally, limiting comments and input. I'll explain more about this later. As mentioned before, understanding my personal background will help me enlarge my conversation. Having an authoritative father who controlled the conversations and never valued listening to mine inspired me in my conversational goals to value others' opinions and to be a good listener. I believe this to be a positive influence on my communication style. My upbringing has also shaped my behavior. I've always felt the need to earn approval or a sense of value. This has caused me to think during the listening phase so I can prepare a statement that validates others' approval of my conversational contributions. This I consider a negative influence on my communication style. Doing the DISC behavioral assessment, it has made me see why I have communicated the way I have in the past. Next slide. According to the DISC behavioral assessment, I am a mature ISC. I am a strong I with a blend of C and some S traits. This means I'm a people person who gets along well with the majority of a given population. I can be entertaining, inspiring, inquisitive, and often communicate well. I have what it takes to be a good leader when assertive, yet can lack the motivational drive without maturity. Next slide. I've highlighted these traits as they directly affect my communication style, both good or bad. Humble, sometimes a little too much and don't speak up when needed. Good listener, or so I think. And I enjoy the spotlight, and sometimes a little too much. I'm fact-oriented, and planning is important, especially when communicating formally. And this can be bad when I focus on planning rather than listening. Next slide. Interrupting. Interrupting is a potential barrier that could keep me from achieving my overarching goals. I have noted that sometimes I'm listening at a level 2, waiting for the chance to put my 2 cents in. Self-conscious listening. I also formulate internal thoughts during a conversation in order to provide or interject my point of view to validate my conversation's value. Faker listening. Pretending to listen but really listening at a level 3 or 4 while paying attention to something else. This always ends up bad, and I usually do it with my wife. Next slide. Flat brain syndrome. Sometimes I allow my emotions to overtake the conversation, preventing effective listening and ultimately effective communication. Again, this always ends up bad, and it usually involves my wife. Physical distractors. Other people's conversations, the television in the background, other electronic devices going off, they all distract, and they distract from focused listening. Next slide. My plan of action is to apply the information learned from HSER 508 to the 4 areas identified in my overarching goals. My personal and workspace conversations will definitely benefit. First, with listening, I will use focused, mindful level 1 listening skills during all conversations, paying attention to the moment, listening to verbal and nonverbal messages, including those meta messages. I will also be aware of my potential barriers. Next slide. Nexting. Appropriate nexting should keep me from engaging in self-conscious listening. It will force me to inhale the whole conversation and respond accurately, appropriately, with or without a response, in order to keep the conversation moving forward, but only once the speaker has finished. Next slide. Controlling emotions. I will also be aware of my emotions during a conversation, absorbing those verbal thuds and refusing to allow myself to fall victim to flat brain syndrome. Next slide. Limiting comments and input. I am aware that in the past I have allowed myself to engage in rhetorical conversations that have more to do with validating my conversation's value rather than listening effectively. The rhetorical style does more to demonstrate an intellectual prowess rather than to communicate effectively. I will refrain from this communication style in the future. Next slide. In conclusion, I have learned that the key to my success for effective communication will mostly rely on becoming a better listener. According to Brown and Waite, just listening has the potential to transform both individuals, relationships, listeners, and speakers. This concludes my presentation. The following slide will contain the references. Thank you for your time, and thank you for listening.